Hey guys, welcome back to 513 Journey. Today we're talking all things flexibility. And let's face it, it's not often that we come off a climb and we say, man, I would have crushed that if I was a little bit more flexible. More often than not we come off and we say, oh, super pumped, or my fingers, I just don't have the strength to do that hard move or that section. So with that in mind, are we wasting our time by talking about flexibility? Or is there something here we're not really getting or understanding? There's some great research out there looking at flexibility in other sports, but also there's a few good ones on climbers as well. An interesting one from 2009 from Nick Draper, Simon Brent, Chris Hodgins and Gavin Blackwell. A few of you guys on Reddit have found this article as well. Really useful, and they propose some unique flexibility test measures that are more relatable to climbing as a sport, and therefore they get some good correlations between that and different level climbers. So we're going to look at those different tests, and we're going to talk about a little bit of the science behind it as well. So words such as passive stretches, active range of motion, length tension relationships, sarcomeres, myofilaments. We're going to get into all that a little bit just so you guys can get a bit of an understanding about how the muscle works and generates force. Because I think the key to this is not so much the flexibility, but generating force through end ranges of motion. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, hopefully it will by the end of this video. So stay tuned, bear with me, let's go do some of those tests and see how we compare. So while we're warming up, I'll go through some of the methods they used in this study to achieve their test outcomes. Basically, they had a board which they named the ClimaFlex Systems Board, which allowed them to get a very standardized set of data for different heights and style of climbers. Now, obviously we didn't have one of these boards and I wasn't going to make one, so I went up to a scatter board and I took all the measurements and tried to mock up that board as best I could using what I had available. And even though it's on a slight incline, I feel like because all the motions are in the same plane of movement, it didn't really hamper me too much on any of these. So the first flexibility test they included in the study was a hamstring stretch, which luckily for me didn't show a strong correlation between climbing level and flexibility. You can see my results are well below the mean test scores. After that, they went into what they call a Grant test, which is basically just a hip range of motion test, keeping the foot in the same plane as the leg. So basically putting the foot up right in front of the knees as high as possible. And then they did an adapted version where it's the same movement, but you can actually place it out to the side slightly. So in both of these tests, my hip active range of motion was well below the mean test scores. The next one we looked at was foot raise test, being able to, on a decent set of holds from a chip, lift your foot as high as possible. In this one, I was well below the mean again. But interestingly, when we moved to the next test, which had one of the strongest correlations for climbing level, my foot loading test was quite good, especially for my hip range of motion. So when I can get my foot up onto a high hold, I can actually load through that very, very well. The last test we did was a lateral foot test, which is just reaching sideways as far as possible. And I did quite well on this. I think because I've got quite long legs for my body. I think that helped quite a lot. So looking at the data, we can find some really interesting results. Basically, my hip active range of motion is quite poor, but when I'm at my end of range, I don't have any problems generating force through my hip. So that gives me a lot of information to work on when we're looking at what we can do to improve. And to talk through this a little bit more, I'm going to put up a comparison slide here between a passive range of motion and active range of motion. So you can see in the slide in the right hand side in the active range of motion, we've got a few elements working. We've got our hip flexors, which are our agonists, and agonist just means the prime muscle groups that move in that motion. And we've got our posterior chain, which are our antagonists, things like our glutes, and they resist the movement. As they get longer, they create mechanical tension, which restricts the movement, and they also co-contract a little bit during the movement to help keep the joint stable. Now, as long as our hip flexor can generate enough force to overcome that mechanical tension and the co-contraction, we'll be able to keep lifting our leg. And we know that because when we look at the passive stretch on the left-hand side, you can see that we've got the available range of motion. It's just we've got a block, we've got something that's stopping us from getting there up actively. Now, as we lift our leg, the force that our hip flexors can generate gets less and less, and this is because something we call a length-tension relationship. So basically this slide shows us how force is generated throughout various lengths of muscles. You can see as a muscle is shorter, it has a hard time generating force, and also if it is longer, has a hard time generating force for two very separate mechanisms. These diagrams on the outside basically show a little muscle unit. You've got myosin filaments on the inside, the blue, and the actin filaments, which are the red lines on the outside. Basically, those blue lines grip and grab onto the red lines and they rotate and squeeze to draw them closer together. And this is how a muscle actually shortens and generates force. Now you can see when a muscle unit is already really short, those structures are really bundled up and there's not really anywhere for them to go. Those blue myosin filaments, they bump into the end of the actin filaments where there's these little barriers called Z discs and they can't really move any further. So we lose all of our force generation. When the muscle is really long, you can see there's not much overlap at all between those two structures. So they can't actually form those cross bridges at all because they can't touch each other. And that's another way why they struggle to generate force in a lengthened position. Now the good news is we can shift this length-tension relationship shorter or longer depending on how we train. So we can use this information to actually improve our climbing specific movements if there's an area we feel we don't have active range of motion. So going back to some of those test results, if you were to do those tests and you found you had a really high active hip range of motion, but your foot loading test was really poor, you might need to work on generating force through your posterior chain at end of range of motion. So you might do some really high step ups onto boxes and whatnot. If you found the opposite, like I found, you might have to look at improving your hip activation at end of range and reducing the mechanical tension in your posterior chain by doing more posterior chain stretching. But to be honest, for my situation at the moment, I feel like there's other weaknesses we've identified throughout this series which are going to make more of an impact for me on my climbing. My foot loading test was in a really good range, and that tends to be the most relatable test that they did looking at climbing levels. So I feel like I've got a pretty good movement pattern throughout my hips in terms of a functional climbing movement. I am, however, going to try and increase my general flexibility just a tiny bit by incorporating a yoga class once a fortnight into my training routine for the next 3-month block. And then we can do these tests again and we can see, have we improved? Has our active hip range of motion improved? Is our foot loading still good now that we've extended our active range of motion? And then we can have that extra information to see just how that impacts our climbing as well. Hey guys, welcome back to the studio. Sorry for the longer video. There was a little bit extra there I wanted to cover. So to answer the question, are we wasting our time? Well, I think it depends. If you were a modern competitive boulderer, yeah, you should probably have some pretty good flexibility. But for the everyday climber, I really think it depends on what you find is your strengths and your weaknesses. So in answering the question today, I tried to give you guys some tools where you can analyze your own movements, look at your passive range of motion, your active range of motion, what contributes to that, and then what can you do to improve the various elements of that so that your movement patterns actually improve. So if you guys want any more information about any of this stuff, feel free to ask me in the comments or send me a message. I'm happy to delve into it a little bit more. If you guys have any other views and things that have helped you, please feel free to add that in as well. Next video, we're going to be looking at a little bit of nutrition and the training plan that I'm going to be doing, and also getting back on that moonboard. This week, probably tomorrow, I will record the follow-up video for that first moonboard problems video and see if we've made any improvements. So that'll be another comparison video. So with all that done and said, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to follow the journey. The support does mean a lot to me, and I'll see you guys in the next video.